Well, welcome everybody. I'm Larissa Picard, Director of Pejepscot History Center, and I'm so pleased to welcome you and the folks that are continuing to join tonight to our final program really for the 2024 year for PHC under our theme, Crime, Punishment, and Justice. And the program tonight really, I think, speaks to that beautifully, particularly justice, and really obviously brings it home to us with the focus on Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I just want to remind folks, if you're coming in, to please make sure you're on mute tonight so there's no background noise for other folks. So if you aren't on mute right now, if you can go ahead and do that, that would be great. Before I introduce our speaker and we get started, I just want to mention a couple of things. One, our actual final programming is Saturday, December 7th, and that is our Santa Day holiday program. And we kind of say that's from ages 0 to 100 plus. So please come and enjoy that. There's singing by Bowden's Miscellanea, their a cappella, women's a cappella group, and lots of fun and treats, and our exhibits are open and that sort of thing. That evening is our member holiday party. You do have to be a PHC member to attend that, but you can become one quite easily. And that's a really, really fun event. And that's inside our Schofield Whittier house. As we call it, the Schofield After Dark Party. We will be closed to the public in January, as we have been for the last few years, but really will be back with a roar in February. We are focusing in 2025 on the theme, the land and its people. All of our programming will relate to land issues, development, conservation, people's history on the land in different areas of our region over time. And we have a lot of really exciting things in the works for that. One last thing I want to note about tonight's program, Susanna Ashton is going to be talking about her book, and that book is on order for us and will be for sale both in our brick and mortar shop at our museum and online through our online store. But it's also available in many areas right now. And when you see the first slide actually of the slideshow tonight, there is a QR code there. So you can capture that if you like, but we'll send a follow-up email with the information as well. Okay, without further ado, I'm happy to welcome Susanna Ashton, who's a professor of English at Clemson University. Her work has been profiled in the New York Times, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, the Smithsonian, and hundreds of other media outlets. She's authored, edited, or co-authored multiple titles on American literary and cultural history. And her most recent book, which she's speaking about tonight, is A Plausible Man, the True Story of the Escaped Slave Who Inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. Susanna's received a number of awards, grants, and honors, including a Fulbright scholarship and fellowships from Harvard's Hutchins Center for African and African American Studies and Yale's Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. So please join me in welcoming Susanna, and we'll turn it over to her.
Thank you. If you could turn on the slides, please. I'm so glad to be speaking with you all. It's been a long time since I've been up in Brunswick. I've got to get back up there when I can. Right now, I'm still in South Carolina. We had a little bit of a technical issue with the slides. So actually, Larissa's going to be controlling the slides, and I'm just going to yell, move them along or something every moment or two so we can get them there. So what I want to start out with now is that this is a story that deeply concerns Maine and Stowe. But for me, it also concerns South Carolina and Canada and England, and it really concerns stitching our nation back together and how connected parts of our nation are and need to be, perhaps now more than ever. So, with those thoughts, let me launch into my project. So, next slide, please. John Andrew Jackson was born in South Carolina. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, oh, there we go. Still coming.
Right, hold on one sec.
I don't know.
There we go.
Yeah, you're getting it. Okay. John Andrew Jackson was born in South Carolina, and he wrote a very, very short, just like a very brief memoir about his life that is very little known. I won't say I discovered it, but no one's ever sort of done anything with it. And 15 years ago, I decided to reprint it in a collection of narratives called I Belong to South Carolina. And although he was just one of 8 people profiled in that book, I really felt like I didn't know enough about him, and his story really lingered with me, partially because he's a good writer. It's witty, it's got sort of an edge to it, it's got a sense of humor about it, and he's telling a harrowing, crazy, dramatic tale, and he leaves out a whole lot of information. But still, you got a sense of his voice, of his personality. So then I featured him in a second book I wrote called The South Carolina Roots of African American Thought. But again, still I felt like his story could be really fleshed out a lot more. Next slide, please. There we go. Excellent. So this is the only copy we have of his book. This is the only picture we have of John Andrew Jackson. You can notice it was published in 1862. So that's right in the middle of the Civil War, which is really when people are getting less interested in these memoirs, these slave narratives, whatever you want to call them. They're sort of waning in topical interest at that moment in time. Also, you'll notice it was published in London, and I'll talk about that. It was never distributed in the United States, which is another reason why it's quite obscure. One of the things he mentions at the very end of the book is a connection with Stowe. And he doesn't give it a lot of detail, but I was interested in it, and I looked into it, and a whole new story about Jackson emerged. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through Jackson's life. And I am going to linger for a while, especially on the Brunswick aspect of the story. But ultimately, I'm much more interested in Jackson than in Stowe. I mean, she's great, but other people are doing a lot of beautiful work with Stowe. I'm much more interested in how, in some ways, their encounter inspired 2 books, not one. And one of the books is his own. Next, please. So the opening line of the book goes, I was born in South Carolina. My grandfather was stolen from Africa. My father learned the African method of curing snake bites and was in consequence called Dr. Clavern. Now, not only is this sort of important in terms of giving us this sense of his father and the generations stolen from Africa, but also it was to prove, and it took me a couple of years to put this together, I got to tell you, I couldn't track Jackson for a long time because he changed his name, and I couldn't figure out his name and who his descendants were because, like a number of fugitives, his name changed. And finally, I realized, oh, wait a minute. He says his father's last name was Clavern, obviously Clavern. And I found out eventually through the name Clavon, that the family is the Clavon family. And there are hundreds of them. And I reached out to them over the years and have worked with the descendants of Jackson. And I also came to realize that the first name here, he's called Doctor as his first name. And every generation of the Clavon family named one son Doctor or Doc. And so most recently, I've become friendly with one of the current descendants, Doc Clavon. He lives in Washington, D.C. Of course, he thought he was named after an uncle, right? Which, I mean, he was, right? But the uncle thought he was named after another grandfather. And that grandfather, no one knew that they had actually been honoring their ancestor who had learned the African method of curing snake bites and was a leader in his community, was sort of what you would call a conjure man. And my friend Doc Clavon today has a PhD from George Washington University, and he works in Army logistics and intelligence. He's a remarkable person, and he is Dr. Doc Clavon, which is just a beautiful thing today. But let's move forward, please. Next. So let me give you the overview next. If you, yeah, there we go. Born in Sumter near Black Creek, enslaved by the English family. Next. He married a girl named Louisa. Louisa was owned by a different family and she lived on an adjacent labor camp. They have a little daughter, Ginny. Next. His wife, unfortunately, is sent to Georgia and she is, quote, remarried, which is about as horrible as you can imagine, whatever that word is supposed to mean. And he's heartbroken. He's devastated. His life is over as he knows it. And he has nothing left to lose. Next. So he flees on horseback around Christmas time of 1846, and he makes it to Charleston, South Carolina. Okay, so now I'm going to slow down and give you a little bit of documentation to unpack these facts. Next. And he smuggles himself aboard a Boston-bound vessel in February 1847. Next. So there, if you don't know South Carolina, you can see where he's from is quite inland. And that's important for a big part of his escape. And I have a whole chapter in my book about this, is he has to travel 150 miles. And the way he does it, because he is full of sass and bravado and attitude, is he sort of steals a horse. And he just, in front of everybody, rides a horse, down his way. Because, sometimes the best way to be incognito is to be like right in front of everybody and to be so obvious. But that also tells you a little bit about his personality, which is a big one. Everybody comments on how talkative he is and how he sings and what a big personality he is. And sometimes they are annoyed by that and sometimes they admire it. But it's very consistent as I was able to track him. Next. There's a house terrible picture on the top, but I took that one. And that is where Louisa's enslavers lived. It's still standing, that house. And this is the house that no longer stands where the English family lived. Next. This is perhaps one that my book, my press was wonderful. They allowed me 50 illustrations, which is really rare. And one of the things I really wanted to show was documents. And out of all the documents, because I'm really interested in sort of the archives and the Black archive and how we read archives against the grain. Each chapter opens with a document, maybe a receipt or a census document or a letter or an arrest record, things like that. But one chapter opens with this advertisement, which is indeed what gave me the title of the book. You can see the phrase there, speaks plausibly. And that's not uncommon, that kind of language. And it's clearly saying, he can talk his way out of things. Don't believe him. He's a liar. He's untrustworthy. And he can carry, but he's persuasive. What's actually sort of satisfying about this advertisement, you can look at the date, March 27th, 1847. And by the time that came out, he was already in Boston. It took them a long time to put that advertisement out. So it's very nice to know they're looking for him in Georgia when he is way out of their reach by that point. Next. He makes his way to Charleston and he does not have what is known as a slave badge. In Charleston at that time, enslavers would sort of rent out or enslaved people, or they would allow them to sort of do a little bit of freelance labor, often, lifting things, hauling cotton onto boats and unloading and loading boats, things like that. And that freelance labor was only made possible if you were enslaved and had a badge to prove that your enslaver would vouch for you. And it would, of course, take 80% of your money. And Jackson realizes he's sort of in Charleston pretending that he has permission to be there, but he knows he's going to get in big trouble because he doesn't have one of these slave badges. Next. And he gets challenged, indeed, by a bunch of white men on the dock who say, "Who do you belong to?" And he says, I belong to South Carolina. It was none of their business whom I belong to. I was trying to belong to myself, which again gives you a good sense of his sort of attitude. The phrase "I belong to South Carolina," by the way, is nonsensical. Like that is not a law. He was just trying to be there, get out of my face, just give them something to make them go away, right? Which worked that time. But he knows his days are numbered and he gets really panicked. And he manages to smuggle himself to sort of aboard a ship. He gets between two big bales of cotton. Next. I just used that to show you about the height of a bale of cotton. It's a little over 5 feet usually. So they're enormous. He's sort of wedged between them on a boat. He has a little bit of food. He has a cloak. He has 2 knives. I think he's ready to defend himself to the death if necessary. And he travels on the ship for a couple of days before he is discovered. And the captain is not happy, but doesn't really want to send him back. It's too much trouble, isn't really sure what he's going to do. And there are a number of quiet heroes that I uncover in this story. And the heroes in this part are the black sailors who are on the ship. And I traced the ship. Oh, that was one of the worst parts of my research because Jackson does not name the ship he was on. It took me a long time to put it together. But it was almost certainly a boat named the Smyrna, which was from Massachusetts, and it had a couple of black sailors on it. And the black sailors saved him. I think they were sort of like, told the captain, "We'll make this problem go away." And when they got to Boston, they took him to a black sailors boarding house, which became very important to Jackson's freedom. Next. Oh yeah, he carried a gimlet so he could make screw holes. He later talked about it in his book. So there's a picture. Next. This is one of the most important, another very important document. This is in his memoir. Jackson says he was hidden by a man named Henry Foreman. Henry Foreman was a free man of color in Boston, and he ran in this very rough and tumble neighborhood. He ran a temperance, a no alcohol boarding house for black sailors. And indeed, by the 1850 census, I could see an Andrew Jackson, and sort of a, name could be any age 24, black, origin unknown. And I was like, well, that's probably my Jackson, but I'm not really sure. But when I turned the page, on the other side of the census was the name Dennis. And in his memoir, Jackson says, "Oh, I was helped by a black sailor named Dennis." So it began to quite unfold how this was the census record showing him sort of hiding in plain sight. Later, a bounty hunter is sent after Jackson and shows up at this boarding house. And the sailors apparently beat him up and throw him out, but they know he's going to be back with the force of the law. And so one of them runs out and warns Jackson, "Whatever you do, don't come back to the boarding house." So yeah, the boarding house is a really beautiful story. Okay, next, please. All right, the next couple of events here. He starts working in a tannery, starts speaking in public. He's trying to raise money for Louisa and little Jenny. He hasn't forgotten about them. He's trying to buy them. And he's making success. He's getting donations, and he's being helped by both free communities of color, free black people and activists, but also white sponsors and abolitionists. He's not getting a lot of traction in Boston, but he goes out to Worcester and Springfield and Northampton, and like out that in Worcester, he's finding friends and allies, and we start seeing monies being accumulated. Some white people start writing down south to try to begin. These transactions are very complicated because you remember, you're dealing with bad faith actors, right? Who are totally happy to take your money and never return your wife and child. So it's a very complicated legal, ethical, and logistical maneuver, but it's coming underway. But unfortunately, here, if you go next, please. He's forced to flee further north in the fall of 1850, thanks to new revisions of the Fugitive Slave Act, right? So he's been prominent, right? He hasn't been hiding. He's been out in public speaking, which means he's really easy to find and people know who he is, and he's really just got to get out of there. Next. So he was assisted somewhat by what we would call the Underground Railroad, right? So the first escape was entirely his own. The second one was he did have assistance. He did have, and it was him. It's a little hazy, but it seems to have worked. I've been piecing it together. It looks like he had sort of white sponsors who would give him money and give him advice. And then he would pretty much go hide mostly, I believe, with black communities, which totally makes sense. You can hide in a black community a lot easier than you can with a bunch of white folks, no matter how well-intentioned or supportive. And how that played out in your area of Maine, I'll explain. He gets up to Brunswick, is hidden by Stowe, and I'll tell you how that worked. And then he very quickly goes up to Canada. Next. By spring 1851, he gets to Canada. He has heard that Louisa has died, and so he remarries another fugitive, a woman from North Carolina named Julia Jackson. Next. And these are some of the letters written on his behalf from Western Massachusetts. Next. trying to raise money for him. There were newspaper articles. This one's complicated, but it featured a response from the Southern enslaver and their neighborhood saying it's going to cost $800. And it was sarcastic and nasty. It's a hideous letter, but it was so hideous. But it also, Jackson was able to carry that clipping around with him and say, look, see, this is what I'm up against. These cruel, condescending, vile people who indeed will vouch for my story in their own ugly way. So next. So then we have this, here is the encounter up in Maine. Now, Jackson doesn't talk about it at length. He gives it very little space. He writes, I may mention that during my flight from Salem to Canada, I met with a very sincere friend and helper who gave me refuge during the night and sent me on my way. Her name was Mrs. Beecher Stowe. She took me in and fed me and gave me some clothes and $5. She also inspected my back, which is covered with scars, which I shall carry with me to the grave. She listened with great interest to my story and sympathized with me when I told her how long I had been parted from my wife, Louisa, and my daughter, Jenny, and perhaps forever. And he has like one or two sentences, and then she gave me money and I went on my way. But it's, and I looked at this, and when I first saw this years ago, I thought, well, you know, she was like, I don't know, James Patterson. She was like Stephen King. She was like such a celebrity author. She was the best known writer in the world, basically. Everybody wanted a piece of her. Everybody wanted to say, oh, yeah, you know, Stowe and I were best friends, particularly if you're a activist in a progressive anti-slavery cause. You want the cachet of talking about how close you were. And I thought Jackson was sort of exaggerating or whatever. This, you know, who knows what he's talking about here. But I sort of started diving into Stowe and finding out that why there was an unpublished letter, again, not unknown, but at that point, unpublished letter, which was at Yale in her collection, where apparently she did talk about hiding a fugitive slave. And I was like, well, I guess I could look into that. So I looked into this letter from Stowe and nearly fell off my chair because a couple of reasons, but it profoundly corroborated Jackson's story and had more significance than I even knew. Next, please. So what seems to have happened is Jackson went up to Brunswick and was directed to the house of William Smith or William Smythe, who was the professor of mathematics, right? He's a fan. Oh man, he founded the first anti-slavery newspaper in Maine. I mean, he had, you know, he had like 7 kids at very points, and he's living in that tiny little shared house. And he's famously, he was supposed to pick up Stowe when she arrived in Maine, and he didn't. He missed her, but he's actually a distant relative of Stowe. I figured out, which it sort of makes sense on why he would have been sent to pick her up when she first arrived. So there's a whole Stowe connection there. But anyway, Smythe lived in a small house. He was an absolute activist and not sympathetic. He was an activist, an abolitionist, involved in all sorts of illegal activities. Next, he also got chastised from Bowdoin a little bit from it. Okay, you don't care how she's related. Move next. This is me. That's my pleasing the crazy genealogist. He was her sister-in-law's mother's brother type of thing. It's crazy. Moving. So you of course all know this house, right? Sorry, I shouldn't have written this. He didn't use his home to hide fugitives. I think he used his home to help fugitives. There's a difference. You couldn't really hide in that house. It is full of people. Even though some of his children were like adults, he still had a bunch of people under 18 living in that house. And there's, of course, a wall with another house. I was a philosophy professor on the other side of the house who also had a big, it is not a place where you can hide anybody. There are no secrets you can really carry out in that space. So although Smythe was super helpful, he wasn't actually hiding people, I don't think, and he certainly wasn't hiding Jackson. But next, so he went to the Upham house I'll talk about, and then Jackson ended up at the Stowe house. And I know about this because of the letter that Stowe wrote. Next. Okay, those are you guys know Brunswick, so you know those 3 locations I'm talking about. Next. So first of all, the Stowe family, again, you probably all are familiar with this. By the time Stowe had moved to Brunswick, her husband, he was a mess, right? Oh my God. Calvin Stowe had accepted the job at Bowdoin, but technically he was still under contract in Ohio. And just to make it more complicated, he supposedly had accepted a teaching job at Andover. all the institutions are furious at him. He's not fulfilling his contracts. His wife is about to have another baby. It's a mess. So what they decide to do is Harriet Beecher Stowe and her younger children all move to Maine, and she has the baby in July or something. And they stay up in Maine, and he's sort of finishing out his contract in Ohio. Bowdoin is furious at him for this, like any college would be today. And he's like, "Oh, I'll start in January, really?" So Calvin Stowe sort of shows up a little bit, but mostly, and this is important, he's not there for those first few months. He is mostly not present, and he certainly wasn't present during this event that happened. Okay. But she's with her young children. She has a newborn, and then she's with, I don't know where the kids, like 8, 10, and 12. And her older twins are in Boston for a while. And so she becomes very friendly with the Upham family, who are her natural. They're genteel, they're conservative, they're a little better established, they're wealthier, they have family money. He's a more prestigious they don't have tenure, but it's a high-ranked professor and theologian, and so they become good friends. And the Uphams, give them credit, they also had 6 adopted children, so the Uphams really had some character themselves, I think. So she becomes very friendly with them. But of course, again, as you all probably know, Upham was, he's no firebrand. He's no William Smythe. He was sympathetic to anti-slavery, but his vision, he was a president of the Maine Colonialist Society. He was an advocate for sending Black people back to Africa. He could not envision true equity or any imagination of the future of equality between people, and he could not see Black people as Americans, right? But that being said, he certainly was anti-slavery. So next, please. So next. Sorry, there's some animation here. So, okay, so Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote to her sister Catherine about an incident in December of 1850. Next. She's talking about Upham. He and I had over the tea table the other night that sort of argument which consists in both sides saying over and over just what they said before for any length of time. But when I asked him flatly if he would obey the law, supposing a fugitive come to him, Mrs. Upham laughed and he hemmed and hawed. Next. There we go. Well, the next day there come along a fugitive bound for Canada, and Smythe sends him right up to Prof. Upham, who takes him in his study, hears his story, gives him $1, and Mrs. Upham puts in bountifully in the provision line, and then he comes here for lodging. Next. Now, our beds were all full, and before this law passed, I might have tried to send him somewhere else. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed in our waste room, and Henry and Freddie and Georgie seemed to think that they could not do too much for him. Next. They hung around him and seemed never tired of hearing him talk and sing. He was a genuine article from the old Carolina estate. And then she goes on a little bit more, not quite yet. Yeah, and so the old Carolina estate, what is that a reference to? You see it was in quotes there. And I realized it was a song. It was a minstrel song. And not only is it referring to Jackson as being from South Carolina, but in Jackson's own memoir, he included a song at the end. And the song he included was the song Old Carolina Estate that he sort of rewrote with his own lyrics. You'll see the next. The original version of this minstrel song, which is often called Dearest May, it begins with using the N-word, right? Listen to me, a story I'll relate. It happened to Valley in the old Carolina state. Jackson rewrote that and says, now Freeman, listen to me, a story I'll relate. And he sort of tells his own story using the lyrics of Dearest May or Old Carolina State. And then she says, and I gave him money and a coat, and the next day he went on his way. I mean, it's exactly what this is. Okay, so I'm thrilled and shocked and delighted to learn that indeed Jackson and Stowe, this is the first time in American history we have primary source documentation of both someone who hid somebody and who was hidden. We primary source documentation on those two sides of that incident. That house is really special in Brunswick because of that. But next. Before I talk about what happened in Canada, let me just briefly finish with Stowe. This is where I come to, the title of my book. My publishers wanted it. I don't love it, but I'm a professor of literature, and I think art is created out of so many things. It's not exact models of people or situations. I've gotten some heat from people who are huge fans of Josiah Henson, and I don't see my story as conflicting with any of the heroism or significance or problems of Josiah Henson. But Stowe was an abolitionist. She had published a couple of little magazine stories at that point. Of course, her family were, prominent intellectuals and theologians, but she had not done much of anything in this, cause, aside from a couple of little magazine stories. But being abstractly against slavery, yes, she had witnessed an auction in Kentucky. Her brothers had helped some fugitives, but there's a moment where it's very different from reading a newspaper, signing a petition, donating money, and your door. Opening your door at night when your husband is not home. Your Irish serving girl is not with you. You're just there with your newborn and your young children. And she opened the door. There's something very different about that moment of action, that moment of engagement, where are you going to do the right thing? What does this mean? This is a human moment. She really believed that, God had set her up in these situations. And about 4 or 5 weeks later, right, she's sitting in that pew in the church in Brunswick, and she has her revelation. She sees the man getting whipped to death, and she starts to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, if I could change the title today, I think I would have used the word instigated rather than inspired, because I think it was that moment of opening the door that gave her some of the feeling of the power she had within her of taking in activism that had to go somewhere. Um, if you know Uncle Tom's Cabin well, the story about Upham and Jackson resonates very strongly with a chapter in her book called "The Senator Is But a Man," where a senator argues with his wife about the Fugitive Slave Act and says, "Well, it's a terrible act, but of course I won't disobey it. I'm a upstanding citizen." And then a moment later, Eliza, the fugitive with her little boy, knocks on the door and he opens it. And as Stowe says in her book, his heart was better than his head. And he gave him money, and he gave them money and clothing and food, and helped Eliza, even though he, 30 seconds earlier had been arguing about how he would not violate the Fugitive Slave Act. So in many ways, that scene comes from, so Jack, if anything, is an inspiration for that scene in Eliza, not for Uncle Tom. So I don't think it's any particular character that helped launch this. I think it helped launch her believability of how we can make a difference, how we can change, how we can act, what acting means for justice. Oh, I'm filling up my time, so I'm going to go really fast through some crazy stories here. Okay, he goes up to Canada. He's in Canada. He's in St. John for about 6 years. I don't know a ton there. Next. But we do know that he entered on the parish census. There are a couple of Black people on the page. St. John's had a big fire, and so there's very little documentation. I found that Jackson registered to vote. But in order to find out much about him, I looked at the person who was on the census page next to him. It was another Black fugitive with a beautiful name, Cornelius Sparrow. Next. And Cornelius Sparrow in St. John operated a business, a restaurant, and he also advertised that he would do whitewashing. And this was important to me because Jackson in his memoir only gives us like three. He's like, I went to Canada, I met my beautiful wife, I got married, I worked as a whitewasher, and then I went to England. So that's like all I have. And I was like, wait, the one other fugitive I know of in St. John was operating a whitewashing business. And I know he and Jackson, they registered to vote together. And they were in the census together. It's almost certain that Jackson lived with Sparrow. Later, Sparrow moved down to Hartford, Connecticut, and Jackson also lives in Hartford, Connecticut. So I think their connection was very real. But next. There's a wonderful picture of Sparrow's restaurant in St. John. Next, please. All right. He's in England next. And he gives, I don't know, 80 lectures, something like that next. He's carrying a letter from Stowe. That letter has disappeared, but we know it exists because lots of people said, "Oh, he's carrying a lot of ministers and Scottish journalists mention that he's been endorsed by Stowe, and he actually has a document to prove it." What it seems to, I think, happened was he was in Canada, decided to go to England, and so contacted Stowe, who at that now was a big celebrity. She had not been when he knew her. And he said, "Do you remember me? I'm going to go to England." And she wrote a letter back saying, "Yes, you are who you said you are. I did, something like that." It's a golden ticket. Next. He joins Reverend Spurgeon's huge congregation there. Reverend Spurgeon is a Baptist who is not really involved in anti-slavery stuff, but got impressed by Jackson and invites Jackson to speak to the congregation. Next. And also Spurgeon has a press that publishes his sermons. Spurgeon was like the Jimmy Swaggart, the Joel Olson, I don't know, the biggest possible televangelist you can imagine. Spurgeon was huge. And his press publishes Jackson's book, The Experience of a Slave in South Carolina, which Jackson says he authored. It's not through an editor. I believe Jackson was functionally literate at that time. Maybe not fluidly literate, it's a spectrum. He may have had some help with his book, but I think he wrote the bulk of it. Next. He falls out with Spurgeon and publishes a furious screed in 1864 saying that Spurgeon has betrayed him and is taking money that should be going to help buy his family. Now he's talking about his father and his sisters. And his Spurgeon is embezzling money. And so as soon as the war is over in 1865, Jackson and Julia go back to America. Next. Here's Spurgeon. Next. And the Prince of Preachers. Next. Next. The London Tabernacle. You just think this young man brought up in South Carolina to be a machine for cotton comes to speak at that enormous tabernacle, which is still there today. Next. And there's even the census. Next. And there's the book he published. I love that, by the way, no enslaved person would have wore that little outfit with the checked pants. That's where Jackson liked to be. He's a flashy guy. I think that tells you more about his personality than it tells you about what he would have looked like when escaping. But okay, here we go. That's all right. Okay, so then he gets back to America. He travels, speaks on slavery. Maybe, I think Louisa might have survived, and that help explains why Jackson is going back and forth between South Carolina and the North for many years to come, but I don't know. Next. And he gets involved in something I'll call you the grist mill scheme. Next. Here's a poster for one of his talks. Next. And he starts writing letters to O.O. Howard up here in Maine. Next. And he's interested in O.O. Howard because he says, I want to buy the old plantation of my bankrupt old master and family. The English family had gone bankrupt. And so up in the left corner, you can see there's a property that says mill. And Jackson proposes to Howard, the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, that he buy this property. Next. He says, I want you to am I raising money for 1,000 acres? He's going to settle 40 black families in sort of utopian sharecropping and timber scheme. Yeah. Next. 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 Like a lot of Jackson's plans, this never happens. He doesn't get enough money together. And so the next couple of years, I have Jackson like trying to found an orphanage. That doesn't happen. Trying to start a school. That doesn't happen. Trying to start a church. That doesn't happen. And I don't think he's embezzling the money. I do have actual receipts of things that were delivered to people down south. So I know at least a good amount of the time he's collecting donations that really are getting to the people. But it's, maybe he was lining his pockets a little bit. I don't know. Next. But the audacity of buying his old enslavers' land is hilarious. And General Howard said, it's a good idea. I can't give you money, but he agrees to like hold the money for Jackson, but nothing ever comes of it. Next. If you go to the property today, it is still being used to raise cotton. That's my own terrible photo, but yeah, it's probably some international conglomerate, but it's still cotton there. Next. And this is the grist mill property. You want a crime and justice theme. This is the exact site of where there could have been, in a different history, there could have been a community of self-supporting Black families there. And this is now the largest employer for that entire region of the state. Next. He's speaking in Connecticut and all over Massachusetts. Next. Sorry, little advertisements where he shows up in newspapers advertising things. Next. Final decades here. Got one last little anecdote and a coda. Next. Next. Rotating through Springfield, his wife dies. He marries again. He has a little daughter who sort of disappears. Maybe she dies too. I don't know. 1880s, he's arrested. I'll tell you about that. Next. He buys some land. Next. Probably dies around 1899, 1900, or 1901. Next. Okay, New Haven. I found he was living on Winter Street, and he was surrounded by Black Southerners who had, next, who had been born in slave states in 1870. Next. And that indicates that these are survivors. So it's not just like the free Black community of Connecticut. It's the free Black community sort of surrounding, I hope surrounding with love and sort of protection, survivors from slave states. Only 5 years earlier, these people would have been enslaved in those states. So anyway, next. There's the asylum where his wife Julia dies. Next. And then in 1881, I suddenly found a newspaper article saying in North Carolina, he was sentenced for obtaining money under false pretenses to work on the railway in a chain gang, a labor chain gang. It was 5 years actually. I have very little paperwork. I have very little explanation from this. Next. He was found guilty by an all-white jury. Next. He was condemned to 5 years. That's basically a death sentence at this. So many people died on those things. Then he escaped. I don't know how. It was just a document that said he escaped. Next. Then he was recaptured. And then shortly he shows up in Vermont. And I was trying to figure this all out. And I have a theory for what happened. Next. This was fun to work on. This solution was fun to work on in my book. So in the period of time when Jackson was escaping, he was free for, I don't know, 2-3 weeks. And what I think happened is Jackson got in touch with probably a white person, wrote a letter on his behalf. Maybe a telegram, maybe a Black person, but I think it would have been a white person sent a letter on his behalf up to Springfield, to the Springfield Republican, which published this little blurb. And this little weird character testimonial was published in other newspapers. He's been farming, he afterward lectured, has since been working. So it's not a news item. Next. But when he'd been in Massachusetts, he was in and out of Springfield all the time, and the Republican newspaper was publishing announcements about Jackson constantly. So I think they were alerted to his fate, and they sort of put this little innocuous character testimonial that suddenly was syndicated in all these newspapers. And I think down in North Carolina, someone reached out and finally was like, this was false imprisonment. You made a mistake. If it was a white person, there'd be a mistrial. There'd be suing him. There'd be countersuits. There'd be a whole paper trail on this, right? But for Jackson, I think what they finally did was like, fine, we made a mistake. Just get him out of here and shut up about it. And he's never welcome back in the state again. Because next thing you know, Jackson's lecturing Vermont, raising money for the freemen. So I think the newspaper, my theory is that the people in the Springfield Republican sort of saved his life, really. Next. Later in 1893, he said, I'm going to go back down to Old Carolina, that phrase again, and there's where I want to die, down in my old cabin home. Next. So I was looking, when I wanted to do research, I wanted to understand cotton. So I went to a WPA interview, which was done in the 1930s, where elderly people who had survived bondage and captivity as children were interviewed to talk about slavery while they're still alive. And these elders somehow had, information you couldn't get elsewhere. And this guy, Jake McLeod, had lived right near Black Creek, near Lynchburg, where Jackson had left. So I was reading it. Next. I hear tell about one man running away from Black Creek and going to Free State, catch ride with people that used to travel to Charleston, hauling cotton and things. Next. He come back about 15 years after the war and lived that place adjoined to me. Came back with barrels and boxes of old secondhand clothes and accumulated right smart here. Next. Next. Talk a good deal about how he associated with the whites. Don't know how come he ran away, but they didn't catch up with him until it was too late. Next. And then I looked at the 1898 Sumter County land deeds, where if you can, up in the upper corner, it was John Andrew Jackson signed this tiny little plot of land that was taken because he didn't pay taxes on it, but it was identified as being adjoined to Jake McLeod. Next. Today, there's a Clavon Street there. Next. So to wrap up, what this story tells me is I'm old, and my mother was born in 1937. So my mother was alive at the same time as Jake McLeod, right? That's one generation away from people who knew Jackson personally. and quite well, knew all his stories. And it told me like Jackson doesn't exist in the historical mainstream white histories of our community, of the story of American literature, of the creative, the most powerful book in 19th century America, the book that helped change the world. Like he's not part of any of that, but he was part of Black community history through the 20th century, one generation from me. My elders in that community knew this story and knew who he was. And it reminds us of the complexity of the intersections of our lives and our world and the possibilities for better understanding how we're knit together in the future. Thank you. That was a lot. Sorry, I went a little bit over, but also like I'm dragging you between different continents and many, 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 many decades and hundreds of documents. So, I appreciate your patience. As I said, that was intense.
That was great. It brings to life a very brief story that we know or we have been told in Brunswick about Stowe, and Stowe is the one who gets the attention, and it brings John Jackson to fuller understanding for us. I think that's fantastic, because he's, instead of a story in Stowe's world, he's a story in his own right here, and that's
Thank you. Yeah.
important. So I think that's fantastic. If anybody would be interested, has a question, please feel free to raise a hand, and we can stay on for a few minutes here, and I'm sure Susanna would be glad to answer. Again, if you're interested in the book, we will be letting folks know how to get that with a follow-up email, so we can put the word out. All
Well,
right.
one thing I didn't tell you, I meant to, for you all would appreciate, was after he left Stowe House, I know he went to Bath.
Oh,
Yeah, so he was in Bath for a little bit, and I think because there's a Black community there where he's safer, right? He can actually hide in Bath because there's a significant number of, I think it was like, 200 or something, but people of color, according to the 1850 census, living in Bath at the time, working as mariners and ship repair or whatever. And so clearly he can sort of disappear in that community for a while. I also know he then went to Portland. And I'm pretty sure he was involved with the Abyssinian meeting house there. And he was hiding in Portland for a few months, I think, trying to get money together. There was no railroad yet before he can get on a boat that'll then take him up to Maine. So he was in Bath for a while after this, and Portland, I know.
that's great. Well, thank you all for being on tonight. And oh, Ellie's got a question. You can unmute. You're on mute, Ellie.
To what extent do you feel you can put assumptions? There seem to be a lot of assuming, and wonderful assuming, into the story. Do you do it?
Well, I mean, in a way, there's some assumptions for sure, but I'm very careful about them. And there's also, this is a book about documentation. That's actually one of the big themes. As I was saying, each book opens with many, many documents. So a lot of my assessments about like, how do I know he went to Bath? Well, he doesn't mention it, but Stowe mentions it very briefly. And then I put it together with the minister who was there. And then I know he was in Maine. I know he was in Portland because later in an edition of his book, he gets an endorsement from someone who is in Portland who talks about. So, I mean, maybe from this talk, a lot of it sounds undocumented or assumptions, but it's not like there are thousands and thousands of copious footnotes. So, I mean, I suppose there are some moments where I'm being a little presumptuous when I say he was, furious and devastated when his wife left. I don't have ESP. I guess maybe that's presumptuous, but I'm pretty careful about where I draw the line and speculations that, can and can't withstand scrutiny. I'm very careful about that, but it is a difficult dance.
Well, I'm wondering, if you're speculating, you say, I'm speculating that, or I'm.
Yes, I'm scrupulous about that. Yes, indeed I am.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful.
Yeah. it's such great history detective work because you said in his memoir, he put maybe 3 lines in or something about
Yeah.
staying with Stowe, and to follow all of those threads and turn that into the full story of him being introduced to the Uphams and then ending up at her door, and all of the steps leading up to that and thereafter. I mean, it's not as if
Right.
he gave you that, he gave you a little bit of information. Stowe obviously provides a little bit of information, but you're filling in all of these incredible gaps by seeking out all of this other documentation.
Well, it's a good question because one of the things I wanted to do was model how much more there is. So, for example, I'm very proud of the section where he gets on the boat and he gets to Boston and he has to get off the boat. And that's actually very hard to get. And I talk a little bit about Black sailors here, but there is a lot more to it, the story. And so I looked up, well, what were the procedures? Well, a pilot ship would come out and someone would inspect the boat. And then I looked at the weather, and you can look for historical weather. I was like, okay, it had just started to snow in Boston in the harbor that afternoon. So I could know it would have been very cold for a South Carolinian. Maybe for a Bostonian, that wouldn't seem terrible, but someone, raised in South Carolina, that would have been brutal. I studied the design of the boat. So I speculate and I say, maybe I know he was hidden. Where did he hide? It was probably this area. So, there are moments where you can get, when you're creative about it, you actually can find beautiful substantiation. And then when you can't find something, like when I was in Canada, I told you I don't have a ton about his life in Canada. So I was able to say, but I do know about Cornelius Sparrow, who I know was his associate. And here's how I know this. And here's what I can build out about Cornelius Sparrow's life. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they both ended up in Hartford, Connecticut for a long time afterwards, coming back from Canada. And, so things like that, you have to be careful about it, but there's actually a lot more documentation than you think. And we're in a wonderful age of digitization where you can find things now that you just couldn't have found, a few decades before. So that's, great opportunities out there to build out archives of women, right? Of fugitives, of people of color, of poor people, the people who weren't supposed to, who are problems, right, for documents or represent cultural problems. But now you can sort of look at them in new ways and do new kinds of searching. It's a great opportunity these days.
That's great. Any other questions? All right. Oh, Janice?
I was just curious about the publication of his book by Spurgeon. And after his falling out with Spurgeon, did another British company pick up publication, or was it only that? And then I wanted you to expand a little bit on whether you think the disagreement between the two was
Legit?
valid and true, or was it just a misunderstanding?
Well, the very, very brief version is Jackson's up in Scotland lecturing, and he's made friends with all these ministers, but he gets in a bit of a fight with another Black man who is a Black missionary who's collecting money in Scotland. And somehow you have these two Black men, one's a lecturer and one's a missionary, and they get in some sort of public dispute. And the other guy decides to sue Jackson for libel or something on his reputation. I don't fully understand, but they end up in the Scottish courts, and the Scottish journalists think this is hilarious. These two Black men fighting in their court system. They're really awful, the journalists. But Jackson says, well, I'm a friend with Reverend Spurgeon. Spurgeon will vouch for me. And so somebody writes down to London to ask Spurgeon to vouch for him. And a letter comes back. I get this all from Scottish newspapers. A letter comes back from one of the secretaries of the church, which is like, Spurgeon barely knows this guy. And Jackson's reputation is garbage. Jackson no longer has any speaking engagements. No one takes him. And Spurgeon really did act like, I think that secretary had it out for Jackson. I don't quite know what happened there, but Jackson was devastated. And from that moment on, Spurgeon was his enemy. So in this little pamphlet that Jackson published, which is like furious and a little bit incoherent and a little bit illiterate, which actually speaks to the fact that it was his own writing, I think, because it doesn't make a lot of, he's like, and he's a Baptist and he's got alcohol in the basement, I swear. I mean, Jackson's like, I think he's throwing anything that'll stick. He's so mad at Spurgeon, but he can't really get his book plates back. So I believe he has a copy of his book, and I don't have evidence. I believe he has a copy of the book that he brings to America, but all the real copies are in England. And using that copy, which has a picture, he then goes in Boston and gets someone to create an engraving based on the engraving of the picture. And so then he could do some posters, which have a very similar picture to what was in his British book, but he wouldn't have had the physical book. So yeah, there's a whole interesting thing about the distribution of these narratives. And there are only, I don't know, 6 copies in libraries around the world right now. And it's very small. It's like a really small little book. I mean, it's bigger than a pamphlet, but it's not really a book. It's quite short.
Well, thank you very much, Susanna. I greatly appreciate you joining us and the rest of you folks, and we'll send out the recording. And please join us for upcoming programs. And happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Bye, guys.
Take care.